There is something worse than losing power. It is losing your dignity in front of the very people who once swore their eternal admiration to you. That night, in the sprawling gardens of a grand estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, crystal globes illuminated the very mansion that Oliver Vacante had built brick by brick over the course of 30 years. Oliver sat there, hoping someone would raise a glass to toast him, but the silence was deafening. The ballroom was filled with influential entrepreneurs, discreet politicians, and international investors dressed in bespoke suits and carrying the scent of expensive imported perfumes. They were engaged in strategic conversations, but as Oliver's wheelchair moved slowly between the ivory-clothed tables, something invisible happened. Eyes slid away to the other side of the room. Oh, it was not an open rejection, but something far more cruel, complete and total indifference. Only 1 year ago, these same people were competing for the chance to shake Oliver Vacante's hand or catch a moment of his precious time. 1 year ago, he was the man who decided the fate of entire industries, the one who financed massive projects, saved failing companies, and created thousands of jobs. He was the presence that changed the very air in a room, the man for whom people stood up before he even took his seat at the head of the table. 1 year ago, he walked with a stride that commanded the world around him. Oliver had not been born into this world of wealth and privilege. He had fought for every inch of it. His father, Arthur, had been a machinist in Detroit, Michigan for 32 years. Waking up at 4:30 in the morning to ensure his children had a good school and warm food. Their home in Detroit had been small, just 2 bedrooms with a yard of packed earth where they grew herbs and hung laundry to dry in the summer breeze. There was never an excess of money, but there was always a sense of sufficiency and a domestic dignity that Oliver would only truly come to value decades later. It was Arthur, a man of calloused hands and a serene voice, who sat with young Oliver at the kitchen table one afternoon. That table, made of green laminate, had survived 3 different moves across the city. Arthur told him with the firmness of a man who never needed to shout, "Son, money is nothing more than a tool. A tool does not define the carpenter. What defines him is what he chooses to build with it." Oliver was only 17 years old that day and had just landed his first job as an office boy at a small construction firm in downtown Manhattan. He did not fully grasp the weight of his father's words that afternoon, but he tucked the sentence into a quiet corner of his memory. He carried that phrase as his internal compass for decades as he climbed the ladder of success. He built his first business at the age of 26, with a loan that took him 5 long years to pay back. Those were 5 years of eating packed lunches, buying shoes only when they were on clearance, and skipping gifts for his girlfriend because the bank installment was due on her birthday. He expanded his empire with careful criteria and deep respect, while always keeping the living memory of his father Arthur waking up in the dark. For a long time, even after he became one of the wealthiest men in the Northeast, Oliver never forgot where he came from or the people who worked for him. He would personally visit employees who were hospitalized, and he made it a point to know the names of the security guards' children. One Christmas, he distributed holiday baskets personally to the cleaning staff without delegating the task or using intermediaries. He carried the heavy boxes himself to their cars, wanting them to know he saw their hard work. One December afternoon, 3 years before the tragedy, he learned that George, who had been a security guard at the corporate headquarters for 11 years, had lost his wife to an aggressive cancer. George was left alone with 3 children, aged 8, 11, and 14. Oliver immediately canceled a high-stakes meeting with foreign investors to drive to the funeral in a modest neighborhood in Queens that he had never visited before. He stayed for over 2 hours, not to give a speech or take photos for a PR stunt, but simply to be there. He sat in the back, a silent witness to a man's grief. The following week, Oliver discreetly instructed the finance department to provide full scholarships for George's 3 children, covering everything from primary school through university if necessary. He had only one condition: George must never know where the money came from. "This is not charity," Oliver explained to his confused accountant, who was staring at the large sum of money. "It is responsibility. This man has served me with loyalty for over a decade. And the very least I can do is ensure his children have a path forward in this world. The accountant never fully understood Oliver's logic, but years later, when George's eldest son entered engineering school, he called the company crying. He said he had received a scholarship from a foundation he could never identify, and no employee ever leaked the secret of who the benefactor was. This was the Oliver Vacante who existed before the accident, a man who understood the value of human connection. The accident was a single second of absolute chaos on a rain-slicked highway between New York City and Albany on a Thursday at 3 o'clock in the morning. He had been driving back from a meeting that could have easily been a video call. A truck hydroplaned. A steering wheel failed to respond. And there was a brutal impact that changed the trajectory of his life forever. Oliver remained conscious just long enough to understand what was happening to him in that mangled metal. He remembered the windshield shattered in a spiderweb pattern and the distant, haunting sound of sirens approaching through the dark. He remembered a young paramedic who held his hand while the crew used the jaws of life to cut him out. She spoke with a calmness that only comes from someone who has seen the worst of humanity, whispering, "You are going to be okay, sir. Just stay with me." But he was not okay, at least not in the way she meant. He underwent 4 major surgeries, and the physical therapy lasted for months without any conclusive results. The doctors spoke among themselves in the hallways, using a specialized vocabulary that Oliver researched on his phone during his many sleepless nights in the hospital room. They spoke of spinal cord injuries, thoracic levels, and conservative prognoses. There was one older doctor who finally had the courage to speak directly to him on a Friday morning, while the sun streamed cruelly through the window. "Mr. Vacante, the injury is irreversible. You will need to adapt to a new way of living." Oliver stared out the window for a long time without offering a response. Adapt. That single word infuriated him more than any medical diagnosis ever could. To him, adapting sounded like resigning, and he was never a man of resignation. The wheelchair did not just take away his physical mobility. It seemed to strip away his patience, his tenderness, and his ability to receive help without feeling a deep, burning sense of shame. Before the accident, Oliver was approachable and kind, but the constant pain and the feeling of dependency transformed him into someone unrecognizable. He became cold, sharp, and incredibly impatient with everyone around him. In one episode that he preferred to forget, but which the mansion staff remembered for months, he fired an assistant of 8 years simply because she had adjusted his wheelchair without him asking. It was not because her gesture was invasive, but because it made him feel utterly helpless. For the post-accident Oliver, dependency was synonymous with weakness. On the night of the banquet, he had organized the event with a secret intention that no one else knew. And he wanted to measure loyalty and see if they respected him for who he was or just for the power he used to project. The orchestra began a graceful waltz, and couples began to fill the center of the ballroom. There was soft laughter and the clinking of glasses, while photographers captured images of a staged perfection. Oliver sat alone by a marble column, watching as the world he had built continued to spin without needing his input. It felt as though he were a ghost in his own home. Suddenly, an unexpected break in the protocol occurred. A small girl in a simple red dress, who clearly did not belong in this high society environment, let go of her mother's hand and ran toward him. The waltz filled the hall with an elegance that felt almost insulting to his solitude. Oliver watched the guests spinning in the center of the dance floor, smiling with a rehearsed perfection. These were men who, months ago, would beg for a 5-minute meeting, and women who once clamored to be photographed by his side. Now, they barely nodded from across the room. One of his former allies, Mark Drummond, passed right in front of him, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then continued walking as if Oliver were part of the furniture. That small gesture was more brutal than any verbal insult could have been. Oliver gripped the armrests of his chair, not out of weakness, but out of a desperate need for control. He knew how to read people. He had spent his life doing it. What he saw that night was a truth that hurt more than the injury to his spine. Without his imposing presence and his confident stride, he no longer inspired respect. He inspired only discomfort and pity. A woman who presided over a cultural foundation that Oliver had funded for 4 consecutive years crossed the hall. When she saw the wheelchair, she subtly changed her path, pretending she had suddenly remembered someone she needed to speak to on the other side of the room. Oliver noted the detour with the precision of a seasoned negotiator. He overheard a whisper behind him. "Poor man. He is still so young. They say he doesn't even sign the contracts personally anymore. Things change so fast in this town." Those were not cruel words, but they were worse. They were comments disguised as pity. Pity is merely an elegant form of degradation. Oliver turned his chair slightly, seeking eye contact with anyone, any authentic gesture. But there was nothing. The gazes of his guests slipped away as if the wheelchair were contagious, as if his new condition were an uncomfortable mirror that no one wanted to face. In a corner, a foreign investor who depended on Oliver's financing was talking animatedly with another businessman right next to Oliver, without including him in the conversation. The man gesticulated with enthusiasm just a few feet away, completely oblivious to Oliver's presence. The message was loud and clear. As long as he was strong, he was useful. As long as he was useful, he was admired. Now, he was merely a reminder of human fragility. Oliver felt something he hadn't experienced since he was a child in Detroit. Shame. It wasn't shame for being in a wheelchair, but shame for having believed that the respect he received was unconditional. The waltz changed in intensity, becoming more dynamic and joyful. It felt ironic because, amidst the luxury and the perfect music, Oliver Vacante was more alone than he had ever been in his entire life. It was at that moment, when he decided he would never expose himself like this again, that the small figure in red broke the silence of the room. The murmur of the ballroom was constant and controlled until the girl in the red dress stopped walking and began to run. She did not understand social protocols, hierarchies, or the strange silence that surrounded the man in the wheelchair. She was 7 years old with a heart that had no social filters. She only knew one simple thing. She saw someone sitting alone, and that seemed unfair to her. "Mr. Oliver!" she shouted, with a naturalness that cut through the heavy air. The conversations in the room froze instantly. The orchestra wavered for a second but continued to play. The girl's mother, Sarah, the woman who had cared for the mansion with a quiet dignity for years, turned pale at the back of the hall. She tried to call her daughter in a low, panicked voice, but it was too late. Little Yvonne was already standing directly in front of Oliver. He looked up slowly, not used to someone approaching him without a calculated reason. The girl did not see the chair, she did not see the tension, and she did not see the social judgment floating in the air. She only saw his eyes. "Why aren't you dancing?" she asked with total sincerity. Some of the guests let out small, nervous laughs, while others looked away in embarrassment. Oliver opened his mouth to speak, but no answer came out, because the truth was simple and brutal. Nobody had invited him. Yvonne reached out her small, firm hand with the conviction that only exists in someone who has not yet learned to fear rejection. "I can dance with you," she offered. A thick silence fell over the ballroom. Some faces showed disapproval, others showed pity, and some even showed irritation. How did the staff's daughter dare to interrupt such an event? But Yvonne wasn't breaking social norms. She was responding to something more basic: human loneliness. Oliver felt an unexpected knot in his throat. It wasn't humiliation this time. It was something he hadn't felt in months. He felt recognized, not as a tycoon or a figure of power, but as a person. Yvonne did not withdraw her hand. She did not waver or ask for permission. She simply waited for him to say yes. For the first time all night, someone was looking at him without calculating his net worth or his future influence. The waltz music increased slightly in volume, and the entire room understood that something was about to happen that they could not control. The silence weighed more than the music itself. Yvonne's hand remained extended. Oliver looked around at the tense faces and the forced smiles. Many expected him to refuse her with a polite wave or for a staff member to intervene. But something inside him broke, Or perhaps it finally opened. Slowly, he placed his large hand over her small one. A murmur ran through the room like a contained wave. Yvonne smiled with a happiness so authentic that it disarmed every social calculation in the room. It was the pure joy of someone who had succeeded in making sure a lonely man was no longer alone. Then let's go," Oliver said. He turned his chair toward the center of the ballroom, not with clumsiness, but with decision. The orchestra, confused at first, finally understood the scene. The conductor made an almost imperceptible signal, softening the rhythm of the waltz and adapting it to the movement of the chair. Yvonne began to walk in circles, holding his hand and marking the time with small, delicate steps. It was not a perfect choreography, but it was something much better. It was real. Oliver let the music guide him, moving the chair with precision and turning smoothly to follow the rhythm. He wasn't pretending he could walk, and he wasn't hiding anything. He was dancing from exactly where he was. For the first time that night, the room looked at him, but not with pity. They looked with surprise and something close to bewilderment, because the man they had ignored was now the center of attention, not for his money, but for his humanity. A businesswoman named Fiona, who had turned away earlier, lowered her glass and stood still. Her face changed in stages, like someone finally understanding a joke that isn't actually funny. At another table, Mark Drummond stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. The person he was speaking with waited for him to continue, but he never did. He just stared at the center of the hall with an expression that mixed admiration and deep shame. In a discreet corner, the photographer hired for the event lowered his camera for a few seconds, not because there was nothing to shoot, but because what was happening seemed too large to fit into a single frame. Yvonne laughed every time they spun. Her small red shoes brushed against the marble floor with an imperfect, honest rhythm. She didn't see a fallen tycoon. She saw a dance partner. The music continued, but no one else was dancing anymore. The couples who had occupied the floor minutes ago had stopped without even realizing it. Some remained motionless, others pretended to fix their suits, but everyone was looking at the center. They were looking at the man they had treated as invisible, being seen by the only person in the room who didn't understand hierarchies. Yvonne looked up at him and whispered, "You don't look sad when you dance." That sentence pierced Oliver's chest, because it was the absolute truth. He didn't feel like a symbol of decay. He felt accompanied. Oliver spun one more time, wider this time, and the movement was elegant and secure. He wasn't a man trying to look strong. He was a man remembering who he was before the pain took over. The orchestra softened the end of the waltz, letting the last note extend like a collective sigh from the guests. Silence followed. A different kind of silence than at the beginning of the evening. It wasn't indifference. It was a profound consciousness of what they had done. Yvonne made a small, exaggerated bow, just like she had seen in cartoons. Oliver laughed. A deep, authentic laugh, the first one in many months. That sound, that sincere laughter, was what finally unsettled the room. Everyone understood something brutal. The only truly wealthy person in that place wasn't wearing diamonds or controlling billions. She was wearing a simple red dress and had an intact heart. In that moment, Oliver knew that the test he had organized for that night was over. The results did not favor anyone else in the room. The silence after the waltz was uncomfortable for the guests. Yvonne was still holding his hand when Oliver did something no one anticipated. He asked for the microphone. A young assistant named Robert, a 22-year-old events intern who had been hired only 3 weeks prior, approached him. Robert had been watching everything with wide eyes, feeling like he was witnessing a historic moment. He hesitated for a second, wondering which version of the tycoon was about to speak. The cold, cutting one or the wounded man who had set a trap for his guests' loyalties. Oliver took the microphone without rushing, letting the silence settle completely before he spoke. He looked at the entire hall, table by table, face by face. This time, no one turned their gaze away. It was easier to ignore him when he was passing by in his chair on the edge of the room, but now he was in the center with the word and the attention that had always belonged to him. He had regained it, not by force, but through a girl in a red dress. "Thank you all for coming," he began with a firm professional voice. Some guests sighed in relief, thinking the awkward moment was over, but they were wrong. Oliver lowered the microphone slightly and looked at Yvonne. "I organized this dinner to celebrate new investments," he said with a calculated pause, but in truth, it was a test. A murmur ran through the room. I wanted to know who was here for me, and who was here for what I represented when I could still walk. No one moved, but several guests realized they were being judged without their names even being mentioned. It was the most intelligent form of accusation, the kind that cannot be refuted because it only illuminates the truth. Oliver took a deep breath. He had planned this moment for weeks, imagining angry versions of this speech. He had imagined naming names and citing specific episodes of betrayal, building a public sentence that would stay on the news for days. But there, in the center of the hall with Yvonne's hand in his, he realized that none of those versions were what he actually wanted to say. What he needed to say was simpler and much heavier. 1 year ago, I lost my mobility, and with it, I discovered something more painful than any medical diagnosis. The only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of someone adjusting a dress in the back. I lost the admiration of many of you. The sentence fell heavy, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Facts are much harder to argue with than accusations. Tonight, I moved among you. No one invited me to toast. No one invited me to dance. Some of you couldn't even hold my gaze when I passed by. The glasses of expensive champagne slowly began to lower. Mark Drummond looked at the tablecloth with the intensity of someone examining a rare archaeological find. It wasn't interest, it was pure shame. Fiona, the woman who had avoided him, kept her eyes fixed on a spot in the center of the room with an expression Oliver recognized as self-judgment. Oliver continued his speech, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The only person who was not afraid to approach me was someone who does not understand power, status, or weakness." He looked at Yvonne. She looked back at him with those unfiltered eyes that simply saw a man who was alone. "This tells me something very clear. My fortune created respect, but it did not necessarily create humanity. The words were not aggressive, they were definitive. Tonight, I discovered who my true allies are." He didn't point at anyone. He didn't need to. The judgment was already operating in the conscience of everyone present. "I thank you all for your presence," he added, with an impeccably polite tone. "But this evening ends here for you. My team will see you to the exit." That was the real blow. There were no screams, no insults, and no scandal. Just an elegant expulsion. The businessmen began to stand up one by one. Some avoided his eyes, while others tried to maintain a false dignity. No one dared to argue, because they knew the man in front of them was still powerful, but now he was dangerous in a different way. He was free. As the hall emptied, the echo of footsteps on the marble sounded like a final goodbye. When the last guest crossed the door, the ballroom was nearly empty. Only the mansion staff, the silent orchestra, and the girl in the red dress remained. Oliver let out his breath slowly. He hadn't lost anything. He had simply discarded what was never truly his. There was something liberating in that. The quiet freedom of someone who finally stops carrying a weight that wasn't theirs to begin with. For years, he believed that the respect he received was a solid construction made of trust and history. But that night revealed it was a construction of convenience, maintained only while he was useful. That discovery hurt, but the discoveries that hurt the most are usually the most necessary. Without them, we continue to believe in things that don't exist. And living based on an illusion costs more in the long run than living with a truth that stings at first. The lights were still on, but there were no more whispers of the elite or clinking glasses. A few employees were discreetly packing up the instruments. Sarah stood in the back, paralyzed and pale from everything she had witnessed. Her daughter was still at Oliver's side, holding his hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Oliver picked up the microphone again, but this time his voice was intimate. "Sarah, could you come closer, please?" The woman hesitated, looking around and wiping her hands on her apron out of habit. She walked toward the center of the hall with nervous steps. "Sir, I am so sorry if my daughter—" Oliver interrupted her gently. "Don't apologize." He turned his chair toward the other employees watching from a distance. "This house has been full of important people for years, but today I understood that true greatness is not always seated at the head of the table." Sarah looked down, uncomfortable with the attention. "I have made a decision," Oliver continued. "This mansion will stop being just a symbol of power. It will become an open home." The employees exchanged surprised looks. "I am going to create a permanent program here. Education, art, and music for the children of workers. For children who do not have access to what many here took for granted." Yvonne's eyes widened with emotion, even if she didn't fully grasp the scale of his words. "Children who should never lose the ability to see others as human beings," Oliver added, looking at the girl. Sarah began to tremble slightly. "Sir, this is too much." "Too much," he replied with calm firmness, "was giving millions to people who never knew how to look me in the eye." He paused. "I need someone to run this place with the right heart." Sarah looked up slowly. "You know this house better than anyone," Oliver said. "You know every corner, every story, and every employee." There was a long silence. "I want you to be part of this, not as an employee, but as a partner." The word hung in the air like a promise. A partner, not charity, but real recognition. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Yvonne squeezed Oliver's hand harder. In that moment, it was clear that the man who had been ignored by the elite had just made the most powerful decision of his life. That night, when the hall was finally empty, Oliver asked to be left alone. Sarah took Yvonne home, and the staff finished cleaning in respectful silence. Oliver remained in the center of the hall, right where he had danced. He looked at the shining marble under his wheels and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months: vulnerability. The accident hadn't just paralyzed his legs. It had frozen parts of his soul. He remembered the rain-slicked highway and the steering wheel spinning without response. He remembered the sound of metal folding like paper. During his recovery, he had converted his pain into hardness, interpreting every gesture of help as a reminder of his loss. He had become someone cold and distant, because if he didn't let anyone in, no one could see what he had lost. But that night, the small hand of the girl in the red dress had fractured that armor. Yvonne didn't see limitation. She saw a partner. Oliver turned his chair toward the large window overlooking the garden. Outside, the world was sleeping under distant lights. He remembered his father, Arthur, but not the phrase about the carpenter. He remembered a Saturday afternoon when they had gone fishing at a reservoir near Detroit. They didn't catch anything, sitting for 3 hours in a good silence. Arthur had said, without taking his eyes off the water, "Do you know the difference between a strong man and a stubborn man? A strong man asks for help when he needs it. A stubborn man prefers to sink alone rather than admit he can't swim." Oliver hadn't understood that afternoon, but now, in the empty ballroom, it finally made sense. Asking for help isn't sinking. It's learning to trust the shore. At what point had he forgotten that? At what point did he decide that his value was in his legs and not in his character? He ran a hand over his face, exhausted. He wasn't crying, but something inside him was being dismantled piece by piece. He had blamed the world for changing its treatment of him, but he realized that he had also changed how he allowed himself to be treated. He had become inaccessible. The silent ballroom was no longer uncomfortable, and it was honest. In that honesty, he made a decision that didn't depend on business. He couldn't regain his mobility, but he could regain his humanity. He didn't need the elite to admire him. He needed to respect himself again. He thought of Sarah, and the years she had worked invisibly in this house. He thought of the quiet dignity with which she raised Yvonne. He understood the complete lesson. Power is not lost when the body fails. It is lost when the heart hardens. His heart had been hardened for far too long. Oliver breathed deeply and headed toward the exit. He didn't feel triumph. He felt clarity. The true fall wasn't the accident on the road. It was when he let resentment turn him into someone unrecognizable. But that night marked the return of the man. The next morning was not silent. The mansion did not wake up to investor meetings, but to blueprints spread out on the dining table. Oliver had summoned architects with a clear instruction. I want open spaces, light, and halls where children can run. The architects were confused, asking if it was for corporate events. Oliver shook his head. For music, reading, and art. He had spent the night reviewing legal structures and social impact models. Sarah arrived that morning expecting her usual routine, but she was called to the office. She entered with her usual humble posture, but Oliver looked at her differently. Not as a boss, but as a potential ally. I need you to tell me something with honesty, he said. Sarah tensed, as honesty from a boss often precedes a firing. What do the children you know need the most? The question was so different from what she expected that she took a second to process it. It wasn't about work. It was about the children. She hesitated, then spoke with a firm voice. Security. And someone to tell them they can want more. Oliver nodded slowly. Then, that is where we begin. Over the following weeks, the mansion changed its rhythm. Where there was once an exclusive dining hall, there were now shelves full of books. One of the side rooms became a classroom with large windows. The old ballroom began its adaptation into a cultural space. News spread through Greenwich. Some businessmen called it an emotional crisis, but Oliver no longer responded to rumors. He responded to his own convictions. Sylvana and Oliver's conversations became more frequent and honest. They talked about her humble childhood and how she raised Yvonne alone without losing her tenderness. Oliver listened with genuine attention, not condescension. He confessed how he had forgotten his father's lessons. Sarah told him about the long nights cleaning offices when Yvonne was a baby, and how she learned to walk with dignity even when no one recognized her. One night, she told him about a time Yvonne had a high fever, and she had no money for medicine. She stayed up all night with a wet cloth on her daughter's forehead, praying. That night, I learned we are stronger than we think, Sarah said. But I also learned that being strong shouldn't be an obligation. Everyone deserves more support. Oliver realized how many similar nights existed in the world, invisible to people like him, and he realized he had passed Sarah in this mansion countless times without truly asking how she was. He hadn't been cruel, but he had been distant, and distance is a form of indifference. One day, while supervising a music class, Yvonne approached and took both their hands. Oliver felt a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since before the accident. In the quiet of his room that night, he reflected. He wasn't just falling in love. He was experiencing a deep respect that had turned into admiration. With Sarah, he didn't need to show strength or hide fragility. A few days later, while they were in the garden at sunset, Oliver stopped his chair. For a long time I believed that losing my mobility made me less of a man, he said. But now I understand that what made me feel small was the fear of needing others. Sarah moved closer. Needing others isn't weakness, she whispered. It's humanity. There was no grand declaration, just a sustained, honest look. They both understood that something new was beginning, based on mutual respect. Oliver no longer feared what he was feeling, because he understood that true power is allowing someone to get close, without fear. Greenwich soon noticed the change. The mansion, once a symbol of exclusivity, was now a hub for free workshops and community concerts. Some called it a strategic reinvention, but for Oliver, it was a conviction. His communication team told him that many businessmen wanted meetings to reconnect. Oliver organized a conference at the house. It wouldn't be a gala with champagne. It would be in the cultural space with simple chairs and warm lighting. If they wanted to see him, and they would see him in his new reality. Businessmen and journalists filled the hall, observing the murals painted by children. Oliver entered and took the microphone. For years, I believed my legacy would be financial, he began. But the accident forced me to face who I am when visible power disappears. I discovered that true wealth is measured in human impact. This house now belongs to something larger than my last name. A journalist asked if this was just an emotional reaction to the accident to rescue his reputation. Oliver looked at him calmly. When you help someone who has fallen in the street, is that an image strategy? The journalist was silent. I have decided to restructure my fortune. A significant part will go to this center permanently. He then formally introduced Sarah as the operational director and his partner. She understands better than anyone what it means to grow up without privilege. If this project is to have a soul, it needs leadership with real experience. The silence in the room was profound. Sarah stepped forward with dignity. The businessmen who had once ignored Oliver now saw a man who had redefined his power. When the conference ended, there was a new kind of respect in the room. It wasn't fear or financial interest. It was recognition. Oliver felt that his legacy no longer depended on his status. After the conference, the house became a true home. Oliver and Sarah's dinners became a time for long conversations about dreams and how love can soften what pain has hardened. One afternoon, Yvonne ran to Oliver. Do you know what I told my teacher today? That when I grow up, I want to help people who feel lonely like you did that day. Oliver smiled. Then you are already growing in the right direction. That night, Oliver asked to speak with Sarah alone. You helped me remember who I was before my pride was wounded, he said. I want us to walk this path together, not as a benefactor and employee, but as partners. Sarah looked him in the eye. I don't need a mansion. I need respect. Oliver smiled. You already have that. The wedding was a simple afternoon ceremony in the garden, decorated by the children of the center. There were ribbons in the trees and lanterns made of paper. There were no professional florists, only the children who wanted to make it beautiful for Sarah. There were no fancy caterers, just the kitchen staff making orange cake and sweets. Oliver's only guest was an old friend from his Detroit days. Sarah arrived with Yvonne, wearing a simple blue dress she chose herself. The ceremony was short and honest. Oliver spoke from his heart, telling her that she was the one who stayed when the ballroom was empty. Sarah's speech was just as direct. I know how to recognize when a person is trying to be better. And you are. That's enough for me. Yvonne carried the flowers, and as everyone cheered, it was clear that true nobility isn't in blood or fortune, but in the capacity to see someone when everyone else looks away. The video of the ceremony went viral, not for its luxury, but for its humanity. People weren't applauding the money. They were applauding the transformation. Requests to replicate the model of the center began to arrive from other cities like Chicago and Philadelphia. Oliver didn't let the new attention distract him. He had learned that public approval is volatile, but his transformation was permanent. In a television interview, he told the host that the hard work isn't the wedding declaration, but the day after, and the day after that. When asked about Sarah, he said she stayed the same person even when the cameras arrived. He told the host that Yvonne was right. Dancing with someone who is alone should be the most obvious thing in the world. The phrase was shared thousands of times because it was honest in a world of manufactured stories. The center continued to grow, with more children and volunteers. Sarah led with a firm, sensitive hand, earning respect for her competence. Oliver watched her with deep admiration. He had lost the habit of hiding his feelings and found it to be a huge relief. One night on the porch, Sarah asked him if he ever thought about what his life would be like if the accident hadn't happened. Every day, Oliver replied, and every day I am grateful it did. She nodded, understanding that some tragedies are actually redirections. A year after that lonely night, the ballroom was full again, but this time with life and laughter. There were no strategic conversations, only children running and the smell of fresh cake. Oliver moved through the room, knowing every child's name and story. He stopped in the same spot where he had once felt invisible, and felt only gratitude. Yvonne ran to him in her red dress. "More, shall we dance again?" Oliver laughed, and they moved to a melody that made everyone want to dance. he realized that dignity doesn't depend on how you walk, but on how you look at the world. As I look back on this journey, I realize that the greatest lesson life offers us, especially as we gather more years behind us than ahead, is that our true structure is not built of steel, stone, or bank accounts, but of the connections we choose to nurture when the lights are low. We spend our youth sprinting toward a finish line of success, thinking that the more we accumulate, the more protected we are from the storms of life. But the truth is, the more we have, the more we have to hide behind. It is often only when we are stripped of our armor, by age, by illness, or by misfortune, that we finally see the world for what it truly is. But we learn that being strong isn't about standing tall on our own 2 feet, but about having the courage to reach out a hand when we are sitting down. For those of us who have lived through decades of change, we know that the world can be a cold place, obsessed with the new, the fast, and the powerful. It is easy to feel like Oliver did, like a ghost in a room full of people who only value what you can do for them. But the real secret of a life well lived is realizing that your value never resided in your utility. You are not a tool to be used. You are a soul to be loved. Dignity is not something granted to us by the applause of a crowd. It is a quiet flame we keep alive by treating others and ourselves with a mercy that transcends status. When we stop trying to impress the elite and start trying to uplift the invisible, we find a wealth that no stock market crash can ever touch. True legacy isn't a name carved in cold marble. It's the warmth in the eyes of someone who knows you'll be there when everyone else has left the party. It's the hand of a child who doesn't care about your titles, only that you're willing to listen to their story. As we grow older, our circles may get smaller, but they must get deeper. We must learn to discard the hypocrites and embrace the authentic, even if they come from places we never thought to look. In the end, we are all just travelers looking for a place to belong, and the most beautiful thing we can do is be that place for someone else. When you see someone standing or sitting alone in the middle of a crowded room, remember that you have the power to change their entire world just by walking toward them. Because in a world of billionaires and tycoons, the rarest and most precious thing you can ever be is simply profoundly human.